Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this ARC Talks. We're just going to give it a moment for a few more people to join and then we'll get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this ARC talk. How should we rebuild childhood after the pandemic? There's been a lot of talk about this in recent weeks and we've got three speakers here to discuss this and to take your questions this evening. We've got Dame Rachel de Souza, who is the Children's Commissioner for England, Sophia Parker, who's the incoming Director of Innovation at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and she has just stepped down as CEO of Little Village. And lastly, we have Zareen Roy Macaulay, who's a recent graduate from the University of Cambridge and a former head girl of ARC Globe Academy. She was the first ARC Globe student to receive an offer from Oxbridge. Before we start, there's a bit of housekeeping. If you do have a question for the panel, can you please submit it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and please include your name and organisation. Closed captions are available. To turn these on, just select the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. You cannot be seen or heard during the event. And lastly, the session is being recorded. So first we go over to Zareen. Hi, Zareen.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Zareen, really excited to be here. And I suppose I'll just give a whistle-stop tour through who I am, I suppose my journey up until this point and how, as a young person, I found the pandemic and potentially what we can do moving forward. So I was the first person to receive an offer from my school, ARC Globe Academy, as part of the ARC family, and I attended the University of Cambridge. I graduated last year, so it was very strange to graduate in the pandemic. I marked the end of my exams from walking from one end of the room to the other, so that was a really strange experience. But I was very fortunate enough to receive an internship from the ARC Ventures team at a time where many young people my age are struggling with, job opportunities. I myself had a grad job that unfortunately got cancelled. So I was very fortunate to receive that opportunity where I did a lot of exciting projects like managing the digital rollout of ARC digital curriculums and starting the first diversity and inclusion network. So that was really great. But I've also continued to have a lot of support from my school, from Globe. I'm still in touch with a lot of people at Globe. A lot of the experiences that I had at Globe, I don't think I would be here if I didn't have those experiences. So, for example, I was very involved with the student body and poetry, slam poetry, and making sure that people knew that poetry isn't just for medieval old men, but rather for young people to use that as a way to express their voices. And that very much propelled me to a place of confidence and a place where I could take kind of grasp a lot of opportunities and help a lot of my fellow students do so as well. So Globe very much has a special place in my heart, I would say. And moving on from there, now that I've graduated from Cambridge, I'm kind of taking a little bit of a break before I start my law conversion course, where I'll be starting a training contract with Clifford Chance in 2023. So it's been kind of an intense ride up until now, but again, very fortunate to have received a lot of opportunities in this difficult time. But I would say that some of the difficulties that I'd mentioned, a lot of people again in my position are definitely feeling. So as someone who has a lot of responsibilities at home, I would say that I've definitely felt like young carers, people who potentially have vulnerable people in the households, and they have a lot of caring responsibilities, have really had to contend with this pandemic in a lot of nuanced ways. I myself have a brother. He's 18 years old. He's autistic with severe behavioural issues. So kind of stepping up, and as well as that, trying to help him through the pandemic, helping him with, the suspension of a lot of his activities, as a vulnerable young person, also having to contend with those opportunities for kind of a wider social bubble, effectively cancelled, is really difficult. And I think is something that has to be ring fenced moving forward for special needs children in particular. And as well as that, I think respite for young carers, for parents of children with vulnerabilities should be talked about more, and that's something that's really difficult. So that's something definitely that I think needs to be focused on, and especially being part of different communities, multiple communities, the intersections of being a Black queer person, having people in marginalized communities who perhaps rely on their outer communities, who have faced isolation, and who have faced young people facing increased anxiety for a variety of reasons, is something where I think communities and strengthening communities and the community care that we have is something that we think about, we talk about a lot in my own personal circles. But yeah, I think those things are elements that I kind of wanted to join in my personal life as a young person that I've felt, and something that I think needs to be looked at moving forward. But that's a brief whistle-stop tour through myself and my perspectives. And I hope to really hear way more about a lot of these things through the panelists and through the discussions we'll have moving forward.
Thanks, Zareen. You made a lot of very good points there about, especially about vulnerable children and the parents of vulnerable children. I mean, they really need support. And I loved your comment about poetry isn't just for medieval old men. As Amanda Gorman showed us at the inauguration, I mean, really,
exactly.
She really sparked a whole revival of poetry, didn't she? It was marvellous.
She did, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And over to you, Rachel.
So thank you, Zareen. That was great to hear from you, and what an act to follow, and really proud to be following you. So thanks for inviting me to speak today. And I wanted to start by saying thank you to all the ARC staff and all the staff listening from schools or colleagues who work around schools and young people, and particularly vulnerable young people. The last 12 months have been such a challenging year for children, but also for schools. The latest school attendance numbers are the best since the beginning of the pandemic. So much of that is down to the hard work, dedication and professionalism you've shown since March last year, from keeping schools open for vulnerable children during lockdown to setting up remote learning from scratch and to getting children back in school safely. It's been an incredible success. I think this pandemic and the lockdowns have reminded us all, including children themselves, of the huge part that schools do play in children's lives. You could see that when schools reopened. I saw children running into school when they reopened, and it was wonderful just to see how happy most children were to get back into school again with their friends and even their teachers. But our children have made so many sacrifices over the last year, not seeing friends and family, spending months out of school, and missing out on so many of the things that children love to do and need to do. And while life is starting to slowly get back to normal, some of the big challenges from last year are not going away. It's part of my job as Children's Commissioner to give children a voice, to make sure they can come out of this pandemic feeling that they've weathered the worst of the storm and there's a happy future ahead for them and for all of us. But I don't believe COVID has made a lost generation inevitable. In the short term, now schools are open again, it's so important that children are able to catch up on the essential experiences of childhood. Catching up will, of course, include learning, and I do think that's achievable. It's so important that we don't panic children about which lessons they've missed or how far they've fallen behind. In my previous roles, I can remember going into schools where there hadn't been a proper maths teacher for 4 years or more, but we got it turned around and we got those children and young people through their GCSEs. I know that catch up in this situation can and will happen. And I'm confident that you and your schools will show children that we know how to look after them, and we can help them through this. I made sure that Sir Kevin Collins, who was on your last ARC talk, was one of the first people I spoke to when I took up this role, and I'm really pleased to be working with him on getting children back on track. I know his focus is going to be as much on helping to boost children's well-being and catching up on their social experiences as it will be on helping them to catch up with their learning, giving children opportunities to rediscover all of the things they missed: sport, clubs, activities, just spending time with friends. It's so important, and there are so many ways it can be done. But there will be plenty of children who found the return tough. Maybe they enjoyed the flexibility of learning from home or find school particularly challenging, and we need to make sure they get back on track too. We also know the disruption of last year will go a lot deeper than children falling behind at school or losing some of their social skills. There are generational problems compounded by the pandemic. Millions of the most vulnerable children were already living in homes with serious problems long before the pandemic. There are the children in care who miss out on the stability and love often that all children need. Children with special educational needs and disabilities, sometimes not receiving the right support and who feel shut out. The social media, which dominates so much of our children's lives for good and for bad, the social and regional inequality, rising youth unemployment, increased pressures on services and spending, and of course, the epidemic in children's mental health and mental well-being, where the numbers of children with probable mental health problems rose from 1 in 9 in 2017 to 1 in 6 in July 2020, according to NHS Digital research. Many of these problems are not new, and sometimes our solutions to them in the past have not been good enough. That doesn't mean we should be afraid of taking on the big questions. Isn't that what children expect us to do as adults? And this post-COVID moment is a golden opportunity, a once-in-a-generation chance to put children at the top of the agenda. This is not just about getting back to where we were a year ago. It's about improving the chances of every single child wherever they live. And I want to be the Children's Commissioner who drives the change that improves the chances of all children. I think we should take our inspiration from how we emerged from the dark years of the 40s with renewed optimism, with ideas and solutions to many of the social ills that have been around since before the war. We need to grab a bit of that positive can-do spirit and be positive about children's futures. The Beveridge Report, published during the war years, created a blueprint for social security for our NHS and for the Education Act of 1944. This is our big moment to do the same, to repay children for all they've done for us over the last year. Let's aim higher than simply returning to the old normal. This COVID crisis gives us the same chance as the post-war generation had to look at what's going wrong for many children in our country and to put it right. And that's why I launched my Childhood Commission in my first month in this role. It's inspired by the same ambitions as the Beveridge Report. It will reveal the barriers that hold back many children from reaching their full potential in life. It will propose policy and service solutions, and it will develop targets to monitor improvements as part of a 10-year plan. It will look at the ways in which society and political structures have often shortchanged children, and it will make the case that children should be at the heart of our post-COVID recovery so that our children have the best childhoods, the best preparation for successful futures, and a better life than their parents. We're going to provide an interim report before the summer and a final report by the end of this year. And at its heart is the big ask, the largest consultation hopefully ever held with children in England. As Children's Commissioner, it's my job to be the eyes, the ears, and the voice of children. And to do that, I first need to hear from children about how the pandemic has changed their lives for better or for worse, what their aspirations are, what's stopping them from doing better, how things are at home, how their communities and local environments could be improved, and how they feel about the future and the challenges facing the world. That's why we launched the Big Ask last week, with a little help from someone you might recognise. And I've got a short clip to show you.
I am your eyes and ears, and I'm here to stand up for your rights. I'm independent of government. This means if sometimes I don't agree with the plans government is making for children, I tell them. That's because I work for you, not the government. The first thing I'm doing as Children's Commissioner is carrying out the largest ever survey of children in England. It's time to give something big back to children in England, and we need your help to do it. What is life like for you? What are your dreams and ambitions? What is holding you back?
The things that are holding me back in life is that I can be quite shy and I don't have the skills yet.
When I'm older, I would like to be a doctor, maybe a surgeon.
When I leave school, I would like to be an army officer.
My aspiration when I'm older is to be a top hairdresser.
I want to be a teacher when I grow up.
If you don't go to school, we don't get jobs. Education is really important.
Good education is really important because you need to follow things in life. If you have a dream, then you should follow it always.
Life is hard at the moment because I don't get to see all my family. Coming back to school is hard because I have lots of work to catch up on.
Lockdown's been really boring and it's been a struggle to learn.
I'm going to use what you tell me to show the government what you need to live happier lives. It's called the Big Ask, and it's a chance to think big and get your voice heard. I promise to listen and would ask you all to take this opportunity to take our survey. But of course, I think it's a great idea. So don't just take my word for it. Here's footballer and children's champion, Marcus Rashford.
Hi guys, just a quick message to let you know that if you're asked to participate in the Big Ask, I feel like it's a great chance for you guys to have your own say really. You know, you can voice your opinions on what's been happening and speak on what you want to happen next. So I feel like it's a brilliant way to express yourselves.
The response from schools to the Big Ask has been incredible. We've got more than 100,000 responses back in just a few days. And it's been fantastic to see on social media whole classes taking part in the survey, talking about their experiences last year and their hopes and dreams for the future. Obviously, I want more than 100,000 children taking part. It'd be great to have 1 million. And I do need your help to do it, because without the support of schools, we won't reach the children that we need to hear from. And we're going into every YOI, into children's homes, into secure children's homes, and we're reaching out through brownies, guides, youth service, everywhere we can. But do it in the classroom, set it for homework, get children talking about what's holding them back, or at school or with their parents, and let's get them talking about their hopes for the future. The more children who reply, the easier it is for me to go to government and to others who provide services for children and to say, this is what children are telling us they want from the adults. I want to see children at the top of the government's agenda. So every speech from the Prime Minister and the senior ministers are talking about children. Every department's constantly pushing to improve the lives of every child. I'm really optimistic the Childhood Commission will give government and others a blueprint for change and transform the way they think about children when they're making decisions about spending or school reform or healthcare. I want us to be able to say we came out of the pandemic determined to do better by our children. After all the sacrifices they made for us, we paid them back. We gave every child the chance to thrive. Working with schools, with politicians on all sides, with people who work with and know children, and listening to children themselves, I'm convinced we can do it. And I look forward to working with all of you to make it happen.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a pretty good number, 100,000.
Good so far, 4 days. Well, it's 108,000.
108, excellent.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to you grabbing some of that positive can-do spirit. I mean, if anyone can grab it, Rachel, it's you. So good luck. Now over to you, Sophia.
Thank you very much. And yeah, it's brilliant to hear the energy in what you were saying, Rachel, and how amazing to have such a response already. Let's hope you get to your million. I wanted to share 3 reflections really to follow up from what we've already heard from Zareen and from Rachel. I guess my reflections are really drawing upon my work at Little Village, which is the charity I founded in 2016. It's like a food bank, but for baby clothes and toys and equipment. And we support families across the whole of London. We've supported, I think it's 11,000 children since we started back in 2016. And so we really are a movement of parents against child poverty, and the families that we see and the families that are supported by other families across London are those who are really struggling. So I guess what I'm going to say comes from that perspective really. And I think the first thing to say is I think it's wonderful to hear Rachel talking about the importance. Of course, we need to ensure that children have the opportunity to catch up on missed learning, but actually to think about catch up in a much, much more holistic way than that. Not only about education, but also about social connections and friendships and time away from their parents, actually, particularly for teenagers. It's such an important chance for them to spend time with their friends. And I just wanted to flag as well that then Children England have done have been running with a group of 26 young leaders a child fair state study, which has similar aspirations really to what Rachel you want to do in terms of putting children at the centre of everything. And so Children England have been working with their panel of young leaders, and those young leaders have been saying, actually, when we're talking about what needs to happen next for children post-pandemic, it's really important to go beyond education, to think about mental health and emotional support, which is often patchy at best and not great quality at worst. They also talk in the Children England work about some stuff which I really recognise from my time at Little Village as well, which is about making sure that the basic resources are affordable. So it might be uniforms, great news today on school uniforms in Parliament. It might be uniform, it might be school trips, it might be transport, it might be equipment, but a lot of these things, if they're not affordable, it's difficult for children to participate. And ensuring, of course, that basic needs are met. Children find it hard to study if they aren't if they're hungry, they're coming to school hungry, or if they have not got enough warm clothes and so on. So I think, first point, really broadening the focus beyond education. Secondly, I really, it's great to hear Rachel talking about, needing to not rebuild back to the normal of before the pandemic. I actually think we should be talking about re-envisioning, not rebuilding. And I think it's really, really important that we recognise that before the pandemic, things weren't great for a lot of children in this country. So 4.3 million children now growing up in poverty. That is a figure which I find very hard to accept, and I find it even harder to accept when the numbers are actually continuing to rise. And we know that poverty has a devastating impact on children. It casts a very long shadow over educational outcomes, over health outcomes, over employment outcomes. It shortens lives. It's as simple as that. Now, that was pretty bad before the pandemic. It's certainly been worsened, and inequalities have been exacerbated, solidified, extended by the last year. And I think we should be very, very concerned about that. So, the school closures have expanded the digital divide. Being in lockdown when you're in a single room with no space to work, crawl, walk, is very different to experiencing lockdown when you're in a better off position. So to truly re-envision for children, I think we need to really take a direct focus on poverty and on income inequality. And I think that does involve looking at things like the way in which the benefit system reinforces those issues, for example, the 2-child limit, and also looks at the infrastructure we're putting around families to support them. And I would really, maybe we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but I think, for modern families, they rely on 2 incomes to keep their heads above water, and yet childcare is the most expensive we have in Europe. So until we start to tackle some of those issues, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to really address child poverty. And if we don't address child poverty, we're not going to rebuild for children. And my last point is just to say, I think it's so important when we talk about children that we have a very explicit focus on the early years in particular. So I love the big ask. I think it's really exciting. I hope in these conversations you're also really harnessing children's imagination. So not only asking them what could be better, but getting them to imagine the future, getting them to dream a little bit, because we need some dreaming here. But I also think, it's important to recognise that in processes like that, it's difficult to ask babies and very young children to participate in things like that, but we must not lose sight of that very, very important time in life. It's a critical time. We know now about how the brain develops in the early years. We know about their significance in terms of nutrition, language, mental health. These are things that are set in those early years. And yet we did some research, Little Village did some research with Joseph Rowntree Foundation earlier this year to mark our 5th anniversary. And what we found is that 1 in 3 families with a child under 5 is in poverty. Families with children under 5 are at greater risk of deeper poverty, more persistent poverty, and poverty is rising faster for that group. So you know, we really, really need to have a very explicit focus on what's happening for those babies and very young children. In the pandemic, I think, you know, they didn't even have the connection of school. So they, you know, they're kind of very, very isolated at a very, very vulnerable and critical time in children's lives. So I'll stop there. I mean, I guess the only thing I'd just like to finish on, I think about this time last year, Aaron Dutty-Roy wrote a wonderful piece in the Financial Times talking about the pandemic as a portal. And I really love that, a portal which kind of throws open the light into the fact that we could build a different future to the one we seem to be hurtling towards, and one where actually, as Rachel said, children really are at the heart of everything. And I want us to hold on to that energy and that hope and that optimism in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. I mean, I think you make a really good point there. If you don't address child poverty, you can't say we're here for children. How do you think we should go about addressing that? And this is really for all three of the panelists. I mean, it's huge, and, you know, as you said, everything wasn't great before the pandemic, and there seems to be, you know, this whole narrative that suddenly we've discovered disadvantaged children, and we've discovered children who weren't learning. I mean, they were there before, but for some reason we seem to have a little blind spot. So what should government be doing? What should everybody be doing?
Is that to me or to?
It's to all of you. It's to all of you. I mean, maybe you can kick it off because you were so eloquent there.
Okay, well, I mean, I think there are many things that that government can and should be doing, and they fall into some fairly obvious categories. So, you know, really thinking about the benefits and welfare support, and, you know, the way in which that is helping families lift themselves out of poverty. So that's really important, and I do think there are some policies at the moment that are kind of working against that. So in particular, the 2-child limit is driving larger families into much more significant poverty than need be. I think we need to look at housing, massive increase in low-income families trapped in the private rented sector, which is then extremely high cost and low quality and insecure. And we need to look at work. So work is changing. The families that we support at Little Village generally are in very precarious employment. As I was saying, they rely on both parents being in employment. So that's a big difference from the 1940s. You know, Beveridge was built on a kind of invisible army of women keeping the home fire burning. And that is not the case anymore. In order for families to keep their heads above water, both parents have to work. And actually what we're seeing in low-income families is they're just really struggling to get the hours that they need to stay afloat. So I think we really need to be thinking about work, the nature of work, how we make better quality jobs, and then finally, how we build public services to really wrap themselves around those children. I really think we need to start to treat childcare as a vital piece of infrastructure, just as important as the things that need high-vis jackets, because families aren't going to be able to stay afloat without more affordable, better quality, more reliable childcare.
Thank you.
Things.
Rachel.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, it's really interesting. So looking at the first responses from those 100,000 children, it's so interesting that, I mean, it's a shame I haven't got them up on the screen, because I'd read some of them to you, but things like fairness in society is coming out heavily. Things around mum and dad. I wish mum and dad could change their work so I could actually see them together. Things around family strain. I think the work point is really salient. A sort of such hope and desire for like education and work going forward, and hopes for the future, but also a real sense of hopelessness as well. That I think, you know, when we were talking about say we're talking about the 40s to now, I mean, never mind the 40s, the 80s or the 90s, you know, there's almost a sort of strand of it, you know, they're seeing older siblings not necessarily getting jobs, they're seeing, you know, all sorts of issues. So we're getting a bit of a real kind of feel of a strand of hopelessness along with the hope for the future. So I think it's fascinating. I think on top of, I think two things I would add to what's just been said. I think one would be about I honestly do not believe that anyone in this country wants to see children in poverty. Right. I don't honestly think you would get anyone to stand up and say that. I think what we need to make happen, I think, is some really creative policy thinking. So we get out of our silos of UC or not UC, or too chocolate or not too chocolate. Let's try and go beyond that and get some better policy thinking and more targeted policy thinking. And I'm really interested. I've been talking to politicians on both sides and ministers and a range of people about, you know, what could we do that would target benefits better to children and to families. So, you know, I think there's policy thinking, but there's also something massive about joined up thinking. What I'm really challenged by in my first experience of working in Westminster, I've been in schools for 30 years, is almost the silo thinking of government. So you've got 0 to 2s here, you've got family hubs here. I'm having conversations with health, I'm having conversations all around, and it's how do we get all this joined up? You know, we've got a range of different departments with summer schools and food and things like that going, but they're not talking to each other. You know, one's justice, one's here, one's DCMS, one's whatever. So I really think we need a minister for children to be attending cabinet to actually help get a joined up strategy for children and to make some of this happen. So, I mean, that was just 2 things in addition to the good points made by my colleague.
Okay, thank you. Zareen.
Yeah, I don't think there's so much more for me to add, but I think one thing that I've felt as someone in a household of, you know, people of color with supporting children and being in my family is the pressure on young people, perhaps like me, who grow up to support our families. And although we're told that as we go, education is the kind of great leveler and it's the way for social mobility, and it's the way to kind of break those intergenerational cycles of poverty and hardship. I think something that's really difficult perhaps considers intersections, the way that we support our families moving forward, and the way that kind of perpetuates moving forward young people who have those additional strains and burdens. And so I think perhaps not necessarily centered on children per se, but on young people, but that perhaps intergenerational and intersectional perspective is something that I don't often see considered in discussions on how social mobility helps young people and children move out of those particular scenarios.
Yeah, that's a good point, thank you. Can we move on to another question? Rachel, in your talk, you mentioned how children were really pleased to be back at school, attendance is really good. Yeah. So what do you think of the government's proposal for behaviour hubs? Do you think the 10 million could have been spent in a better way?
So I mean, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? And I think I've spoken about this before. I think we're seeing, so I think we saw that wonderful thrill of coming back to school, and I think those of us who were engaged with schools at the time, just, you know, it was such a delight. We also have seen challenges, or certainly head teachers I know have seen challenges. Now I suppose my point there would be why, because you know, and I think, you know, when I look at the kids I'm most concerned about, it's those, you know, who've been in the trickiest of situations during lockdown, and those who, you know, who have been vulnerable and the support taken away. And I think what head teacher colleagues are telling me is that actually trauma and vulnerability sit behind some of these issues around behavior and you know, so it's for me, it's the why. And if we get the why right, then we can think of what the support is that we need. I'm probably more interested in seeing you know, mental health, mental well-being support in schools. I'm more interested in seeing teenagers. So that's why I love Kevin Collins's Extra Time. You know, I want to see teenage brains being able to get back to normal because teenagers are able to engage with each other in activities, you know, in school and around, you know, and around post-lockdown, so they can actually, you know, get back to normal. And we know that there's an absolute cause. I was talking to Sarah Jane Blakemore just the other day, the neuroscientist, Oxford neuroscientist. She's saying, you know, we have evidence now that high quality peer relationships, teenage, not lots of them, but you know, as long as they've got some, you know, that is the best indicator of good mental health 10 years later. So I think everyone's trying to do the right thing, but I would say let's focus on those who've had the toughest time, the trickiest situations, and helping to actually solve the problems, and using school in a really positive way to do that. I'm not against behaviour hubs, and you know, I've always been for good, you know, really good behaviour models. I'm totally, you know, I think that's great. But I think on its own, I think we need to support around that with the real support that vulnerable children and all children need, and all children after lockdown, frankly. So.
Okay, thank you. Sophia, you mentioned mental health and emotional support, didn't you? Do you just think the behaviour hubs are just framed wrong? That it should be framed in a different way, that, you know, that what they're helping with?
And I don't know if it's the internet at my end, but I lost you halfway through your question. Sorry, apologies, everyone. Would you mind asking it again?
Yeah, no, I was just saying, do you think from what Rachel was saying there, do you think that behaviour hubs are the wrong way to frame it? Should we be talking more about the support rather than behaviour? Because if somebody says to me behaviour, I think bad behaviour.
Yeah, it sort of implies control and needing to discipline people, doesn't it? So, I mean, I'll be honest, it's not an area I have expertise in. I don't know exactly what's being proposed in terms of what's going to happen in behaviour hubs. I guess, you know, to echo what Rachel's saying, I mean, I think framing it, I do think it matters how we frame these things. I think it matters how we talk about these things. And I think actually behaviour has got a kind of controlling edge to it, and a slightly kind of disciplinarian edge to it, where actually I think really we need to be thinking about how we're nurturing this generation of young people and children. And therefore, you know, really let's really focus on mental health, because it is an absolute crisis. And I think it's a crisis not only for teenagers, but as I say, I think it really is a crisis that goes back to those children who can't even speak about these things. But, you know, some of the stuff that I think has been coming out in very young families is extremely concerning as well. You know, parental mental health in the early years can have very profound impact on how children develop. And it's certainly something, you know, we work at Little Village, we work with over 1,000 frontline family workers, social workers, health visitors and so on across London. And 9 out of 10 of them told us when we did a survey of them last year during the pandemic that they were concerned about children's well-being and mental health and development because of the impact of the pandemic on the kind of family well-being. So yeah, I mean, I think that really is where to put the energy and the effort. I feel like the behaviour, if it's showing up, is probably a manifestation of, you know, the result of those difficulties rather than the thing to tackle.
Okay, thank you, Zareen. It has quite an impact on children with vulnerabilities, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think particularly access to mental health services throughout the pandemic for children with vulnerabilities has been really difficult, because I think, you know, we take it for granted that, or rather accessing things digitally is hard in itself. But then also I think if you have vulnerabilities or special needs, accessing things digitally might not be the easy solve that a lot of people think it is. So for example, my brother can't really engage with CBT very well via a video cam, for example, which has proven really difficult throughout the pandemic for him to get the services that he needs, which already were really hard to access, considering the kind of NHS wait times, etc. So I think it's something, you know, if we're speaking about mental health, we're speaking about it's linked to behaviour and well-being. Access to those services in the first place has been really challenging. And then if we're looking at its impact on behaviour, then having a more nuanced, I think, empathetic stance towards it, rather than, you know, I've seen a little bit about behaviour hubs, and it does feel you know, maybe that's not necessarily the intention, but the tone is punitive rather than empathetic. And I think from the perspective of having caring responsibilities, that's not necessarily the way I think it should be.
Okay, thank you. Got some questions coming in. I'm going to put this one first because I think it's probably relevant to what we've been talking about. From Karen with Pisa, lockdown has actually been a positive experience for some families and children. How can you pursue the important points you have been making without negating these families' experiences and catastrophizing childhood? That's quite a strong expression, catastrophizing childhood. Who'd like to come in and take that one on first?
Yeah, I'm happy to, Anne. So, I mean, I think Karen's absolutely right. We have heard from lots of children that that actually they've enjoyed being with their parents, and particularly some of the things. There are lessons that we've learnt through lockdown in terms of what, you know, our work with online learning that I think we'd want to take on into the future, particularly for young people with some young people with special educational needs, and how well lockdown learning and a calm environment has worked. I think also actually, you know, I think we picked up on, you know, and this is certainly something I've experienced a lot in the areas I've worked, where you've got, you know, young families working mum and dad working long hours, long jobs, often at separate times so they can manage childcare. So children actually having both, you know, children talking to us about having both parents at home and how great that's been, and just to spend some time. So I think there are lessons to learn. There are educational lessons to learn. There are lessons that we've learned from using online learning really well, and it's sort of, I mean, just think of something like Oak National Academy, how everyone just got together, sorted it out, and made a curriculum that everyone could follow. That's been a holy grail for years, that we'd all share everything and do that. So it's brought out the best in some ways. So I think we mustn't lose those lessons. I don't think we're catastrophizing childhood, though. I think for me, this is like a punctuation mark. It's like a line in the sand where we can actually rocket boost a brilliant approach to childhood in this country. I want to see it as a, you know, let's now build on what we've learned, build on this this time that has been difficult for many, and try and like turn around these issues around childhood and go for the positive. So, you know, I've got some sympathy for Karen's points.
Okay, thank you. Zareen, what do you think of that? Do you think we're catastrophizing it? I mean, we're either in danger of catastrophizing or we're romanticizing. I think we can never seem to get a middle ground. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that I don't think it can be denied that I'm sure a lot of families have felt some benefits of lockdown. A lot of the people that I've spoken to have said that they've really appreciated the time that they can spend with their families. I did, up until the point that they got a bit much, but people have definitely said that, you know, working from home and being able to spend time with their children, etc., has been beneficial. I think catastrophizing childhood is a strong point that I don't necessarily think that emphasizing the difficulties of lockdown necessarily translates to that. I think a lot of the things that we are talking about were things that have been exacerbated by lockdown, or rather have been highlighted. So, you know, whether it's access to mental health services, whether it's anxiety around the, you know, for young children and behavior, etc. So I think those things are being highlighted by lockdown rather than presenting lockdown as this, you know, this kind of all-encompassing wrong that's been done to children. Obviously, it's been a terrible time, but I do think that overall, for me, the setbacks have been significant. And while we can acknowledge that there have been benefits, I think I'd lean towards highlighting those things and not shying away from them.
Fair enough. I'm going to go on to another question and take it straight to you, Sophia. It's how do we reconcile the recognition of importance of childhood play as part of their development with pressure on schools to increase hours and potential of summer school? There's quite a lot in there. So you've got two competing things.
Yeah. I'm just trying to figure out what's underneath that question, because I mean, I think that, as you say, there's a lot in that. I think, well, what do I think? I mean, I think play is obviously a really critical part of child development, particularly in the early years and in the kind of initial years of school, although I kind of think it's quite important for all of us, whatever our age as well, but that's probably a separate point. And I guess, for me, the fact that we've become very much more focused on kind of academic achievement and so on is partly because we've started to see education, you know, very in those very academic terms, and we've sort of lost sight of some of the way we've talked about early year childcare in the past. You know, certainly in the 70s when I was growing up, you know, my parents were part of a playgroup, which is what you might call a nursery now, but you know, there was nothing, there was no educational target set there. It was just making sure that we all had a good time. So I guess there's a kind of, I don't know whether it's as childcare has emerged as a kind of sector, it then gets professionalized and then starts to have targets put around it, particularly as government has started to put more money into it. It loses some of that kind of the benefits of it being a sort of informal parent to parent activity. But anyway, that's not a great answer to the question, because I'm not sure it's quite where I have knowledge. But just a couple of reflections there. There is just one thing I want to say on the previous question, though, which is I think there is a catastrophe when 1 in 2 children in certain parts of London are growing up in poverty. It is a catastrophe. It's not a catastrophe that's being created by the pandemic, but it is a very serious public crisis that hasn't had enough attention, and I think it is really important we kind of don't kind of let that go. What I would say is, in terms of the other parents, what we've experienced at Little Village is there's enormous solidarity between parents who've actually not had it so hard and with those parents who are struggling, and I think there's an enormous weight, a depth of love, compassion, empathy, solidarity that we can draw on to support those families who have been struggling, and that those who have not found it so hard, who have found there have been nice things about the pandemic, actually are very conscious that that is not the universal experience, and that is a really powerful resource we can work with, and we've certainly seen that at Little Village. But anyway, sorry, I cheekily took the opportunity to answer that previous question as well.
Come back a question. So, Rick, what about the competing interests?
So was that to me?
Yeah, of the previous question.
So I think it's a really interesting question, because we're right at the point now, aren't we, where Kevin is working on his catch-up plans. He's got his 3 T's. Just a couple of reflections. I mean, certainly as someone who's worked in sponsored academies all my life and in challenging disadvantaged areas, we always put summer schools on, and those summer schools were always a mix of work and play, and they were always voluntary, right? And I think in there lies some of the answer. So what's interesting is last summer when I certainly opened my old schools up in Inspiration Trust in mid-August for the examination groups were desperate to get back. I mean, they were running to school, they were asking us to do it. No one had to come, and no teacher had to do it. It was completely voluntary. But I also think, I mean, what a great opportunity this summer to get all the activities, all the fun stuff, all the sort of wider things going, and get, you know, provide a safe place for those activities to happen. A little bit of English and maths wouldn't hurt either. There's no harm with a little bit of catch up, I'd always say, as long as we also, you know, recognise the need for young people to be with their peers and to be really enjoying it. I mean, I'm looking at one of my biggest areas of worry is Key Stage 1. So it's actually, yeah, I think the teenagers, I think we know what to do. I'm looking at Key Stage 1 and thinking about language, those key milestones around language, things that, you know, those little ones just aren't, you know, haven't been in their classrooms enough and with their peers enough. And again, that's where play, but social activity guided and supported by people who really know what they're doing could really help families. Because I think I'm hearing that a lot of worries from parents about isolated younger primary children. So I mean, I'd say take the opportunity and come on. There are youth groups, outward bound groups, community groups, loads of people dying to put great stuff on. So we just need the government to give us a great settlement for this summer and for the next 3 years to really make sure that fantastic activities and academic catch-up can happen. And I honestly don't think there's, you know, that there is no talk of anyone having to do this. This is about a voluntary, positive, people with loads of people wanting to step into this space and do it to support young people. So I'm in favour, and I think we can do both.
Okay, but just give us the money.
Well, yes.
I'm going to take another question and to come straight to you, Zareen, on this. How do we ensure, this is from Kelly Chalice at the Driver Youth Trust, how do we ensure that aspirations are as high as possible for learners with SEND and not curtailed by a lack of assessment or intervention or in experienced teachers in schools, or shrouded in the catch-up discussion? Zareen.
Sure. Big question. So just to make sure I've got it right, so how can we ensure that young people with kind of special educational needs can progress without, you know, getting mired in the whole catch-up discussion with assessments, etc.?
Yeah,
sure. So I think a big part of helping young people with special educational needs broaden their horizons beyond the school environment, I think something we've touched upon: youth groups, community groups, things that allow those young people to have an exposure to different interests and aspirations that may not always be filtered through the school environment. So I, you know, again, speaking from personal experience, that's exactly what's happened with my brother. A lot of the ways in which he has progressed and the ways in which he's found different interests that, you know, aren't necessarily linked to his performance in things like English and maths are through youth groups. So there's a group called Heart and Soul, which works with autistic young people in introducing them to music lessons, introducing them to drama and dance and creative outlets that don't always have a huge focus. And I think those community groups and that support from role models in the community are really important, and make sure that those young people can flourish through kind of different social interactions, but also these particular activities that lead to kind of other goals that can go beyond activities. You know, my brother doesn't necessarily have specific career goals in mind, but I know what he wants, what the things that he enjoys. I know the things that help him interact with other people, and it's through those community groups. So I think encouraging those groups to continue is really crucial, and is something that I've seen is really beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Safa, do you want to add anything to that?
Just a note. I mean, I totally agree with what Zareen's just said. I would say also to keep an eye on the early years. So during the pandemic, 60% of health visitors were redeployed to other activities, quite rightly, but that on the back of many cuts within that service means that actually what's showing up now is that there are many young children, preschool children, without those connections to to schools and to nurseries, are now showing up, you know, with signs of adversity, developmental delay, safeguarding issues that just weren't picked up because they were kind of getting lost to the system. So I think there's a really important piece of work to ensure that those children, those babies who are born in lockdown or who are kind of in their toddler years during lockdown, we're kind of catching up with them and reconnecting and reintegrating them into some kind of framework of support that is picking up SEN issues early enough that that they're then getting the support that's needed so that they can flourish and thrive as well.
Okay, thank you. We've not got very much time left, so I'm going to take one more question, and if you want to add to that, Rachel, when I ask you this one, so I'm going to do it that way round. This is from Liz Taylor. The last year has seen parents, particularly of younger children, playing a much more active role in their children's learning. How do you see us building on that and prioritising parents and parental engagement in learning in the future?
Well,
and if you answer nice and quickly, because I need to get the other two in and then do a wrap up.
Just to say, yes, what a fantastic question. And it's the holy grail, isn't it, to get parents really involved and understanding and confident. I'll never forget going to China and watching those tiger mums in just ordinary Chinese towns, absolutely engaged with their children's education. Now, I'm not suggesting we become a nation of tiger mums, but I think we have to get parents across that school threshold. We have to give them confidence, and the confidence to understand the curriculum. We need to spend more time doing that and working on sort of opening our doors in schools to be more as centres for supporting parenting. I think it's a key issue. On the SEND issue and the SEN issue, everything everyone said is great. I would just say we've got an SEN review promised and ongoing. Isn't this the moment for some radical thinking about doing things really different there? If I was going to be, I was an education reformer 15 years ago, and that's been that was my path. Now I think I'd want to be a SEND reformer and a pre-care threshold reformer. I think that's the area of the system that is ripe now for some really different thinking. And now, we've got these SEND reviews, care reviews going on. Let's grab it. Let's do different, and let's think radically rather than just just settle. Let's do it.
Okay, thank you. Sophia, how do we keep the parents involved?
Yeah, great question. This is a little while back now. I did a study looking at childcare cooperatives, which is a model that isn't very common in this country, but it's basically about parents being involved in the delivery of childcare in nurseries alongside professionals. And one of the things that's brilliant about that model is that it basically builds parental confidence as agents of learning for their children. I think it's something parents lack confidence in. And actually, one of the findings of this research we did on childcare co-ops is that the single best thing you can do to continue to keep parents engaged is to get them working alongside professionals who are almost building their confidence, showing them it's possible, getting stopping things like phonics seeming quite so scary and mysterious, showing them some simple techniques. So I think it's very much about thinking about the partnership between the professionals and the parents, and recognizing that parents and parental involvement in education has got a pretty big impact on those certainly in primary school, in the educational outcomes we see alongside what the school's doing. Definitely partnership.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, so I'm sorry I won't be able to take any more questions. Thanks to everybody for sending them in. They've been great, really making us think. And I'm going to pass back to Rachel to hear her reflections on what she's heard and to tell us what her next steps are.
I mean, just really simply, first I'd like to thank Zareen and Sophia for such fantastic and challenging thought. And Zareen, the voice of, I'm going to call you a young person, you probably a young adult, the voice of the real voice of young people are what we need to hear, because that shows us the way that we need to go. And I do think we're at a transformative moment, and that this is coming out of this pandemic is the time that we need to grab it. And I certainly will be sharing what the nation's children say, and I'll be writing it large. And I think it's time for joined up strategy for childhood, vulnerable children right at the centre of it, but most importantly at the heart of that, children and young people's voice. So thanks very much to Sophia and Zareen for all the challenge, and now we have the job to do to sort it all out.
Okay, so thank you to all three of you, and you just need to get another is it 870,000 responses or whatever it is?
We're on it, Anne.
We're on million.
We're
So
on it. Tweet it for me. Get it out there.
Start filling it in.
Come
So
on.
Thank you all so much. That was really good. Thank you for your input. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you to ARC for putting this on. So thanks very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.